Imagine a place where the mountains meet a fierce spirit of independence, a land forged in centuries of resistance. This is Chechnya, a small republic in the North Caucasus that, in the mid-1990s, became the stage for one of the most brutal conflicts of the late 20th century. Today, we're delving into the First Chechen War, a story of ambition, miscalculation, and immense human suffering that sent shockwaves through the newly formed Russian Federation. To understand why this war happened, we need to rewind a bit. The relationship between Russia and the peoples of the Caucasus has always been complex, marked by centuries of conflict and conquest. For the Chechens, a fiercely independent people with their own unique language, culture, and traditions, Russian rule was often seen as foreign occupation. This feeling didn't just disappear with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. In fact, it intensified as the USSR crumbled. A wave of nationalism swept across its former territories. In Chechnya, a former Soviet Air Force general named Johar Dudayev seized this moment. He declared Chechnya's independence from Russia, tapping into a deep-seated desire for self-determination. For 3 years, Moscow, grappling with its own monumental political and economic challenges, largely adopted a hands-off approach. Chechnya operated in a state of de facto independence, a gray zone of sovereignty. But by 1994, the Kremlin's patience had run out. President Boris Yeltsin's government faced a host of problems: a struggling economy, political instability, and the fear that Chechnya's secession could trigger a domino effect, causing the entire Russian Federation to unravel. The idea of a small oil-rich republic breaking away was seen as an existential threat. So, after a failed covert attempt to overthrow Dudayev using Chechen opposition forces, Moscow decided on a direct, overwhelming show of force. The thinking was simple: a quick, victorious war would reassert Moscow's authority, boost national morale, and secure the region. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. In December 1994, Russian tanks and troops rolled into Chechnya. The military leadership promised a swift operation, a small, victorious war that would be over in a matter of weeks, if not days. The plan was to storm the capital Grozny in a decisive New Year's assault. What they encountered, however, was not a disorganized militia, but a highly motivated and determined force of Chechen fighters. These weren't just soldiers. They were men defending their homes, their families, and their idea of a nation. They knew every street, every alley, and every building in Grozny. The New Year's assault on Grozny turned into a bloodbath. Russian armored columns, designed for open-field warfare on the plains of Europe, were sitting ducks in the tight urban environment. Chechen fighters, operating in small mobile groups, used basements and rooftops to launch devastating attacks with rocket-propelled grenades, turning Russian tanks and armored personnel carriers into burning metal coffins. The Russian forces were poorly trained, demoralized, and lacked effective coordination. Many of the soldiers were young conscripts who had no idea why they were fighting and dying in this strange city. The initial assault was a complete disaster, with staggering losses for the Russian army. The failure to take Grozny quickly transformed the conflict. The war devolved into a brutal, grinding siege. The Russian military, frustrated and humiliated, resorted to overwhelming firepower. They subjected Grozny to relentless artillery bombardment and airstrikes, reducing the once beautiful city to a hellscape of rubble and ruins. For weeks, the world watched in horror as a European capital was systematically destroyed. The fighting was street to street, house to house, a merciless struggle for every inch of ground. The civilian population was caught in the crossfire. Thousands were killed, and hundreds of thousands were forced to flee their homes, becoming refugees in their own land. The humanitarian crisis was immense. Stories of atrocities committed by both sides began to emerge, painting a grim picture of the war's brutality. The conflict wasn't confined to Grozny either. As the Russian military slowly gained control of the flattened capital, the fighting spread into the rugged mountains and countryside of southern Chechnya. Here, the nature of the war shifted again. The Chechen fighters, led by charismatic commanders like Shamail Bazayev and Aslan Maskhadov, reverted to classic guerrilla tactics. They used their intimate knowledge of the mountainous terrain to launch hit-and-run attacks, lay ambushes, and plant mines, inflicting a steady stream of casualties on the much larger Russian army. For the Russian soldiers, it was a nightmarish campaign against an invisible enemy. Punctuated by sudden violent death, morale plummeted. Back in Russia, the war was becoming deeply unpopular. Unlike the Soviet era, Russia now had a nascent free press. Journalists brought the graphic, uncensored reality of the conflict into Russian living rooms every night. The public saw the images of dead young soldiers, the destroyed city, and the suffering civilians. The government's narrative of a quick police action was falling apart. Mothers of soldiers organized protests, demanding an end to the war and the return of their sons. The conflict was becoming a political and social wound that was bleeding the country dry, both financially and morally. The Chechen fighters, despite their successes in guerrilla warfare, knew they couldn't defeat the Russian army in a conventional sense. So, they changed their strategy, deciding to take the war into Russia itself. In June 1995, a group of fighters led by Shamil Bazayev launched a shocking raid on the Russian town of Budianovsk, seizing a hospital and taking over 1,500 people hostage. Their demand was simple: an end to the war and the start of negotiations. After a botched rescue attempt by Russian special forces resulted in more casualties, the Kremlin was forced to negotiate. A temporary ceasefire was brokered, and the fighters were given safe passage back to Chechnya in exchange for releasing the hostages. The Budianovsk crisis was a turning point. It was a massive humiliation for the Russian government, but it also forced them to the negotiating table. However, the peace was fragile and short-lived. The war soon resumed its brutal rhythm of guerrilla attacks and Russian reprisals. But the political landscape in Russia was changing. The 1996 presidential election was looming, and the deeply unpopular war was a major liability for President Yeltsin. He needed a way out. In a surprise move, Alexander Lebed, a popular general and Yeltsin's new security advisor, flew to Chechnya to personally negotiate an end to the conflict. Meanwhile, Chechen forces launched a daring and brilliantly executed surprise attack, codenamed Operation Jihad, and retook the capital Grozny. In August 1996, they surrounded and trapped the demoralized Russian garrison, dealing a final decisive blow. The Russian military was defeated. Faced with a military catastrophe and intense political pressure, Lebed signed the Case-of-Yurt Accord with the Chechen Chief of Staff, Aslan Maskhadov. The agreement called for an immediate ceasefire and the complete withdrawal of Russian troops. Crucially, it postponed a final decision on Chechnya's political status for 5 years, until 2001. For the Chechens, it was a victory. They had fought a superpower to a standstill and had, for all intents and purposes, won their independence. For Russia, it was a profound national humiliation. The First Chechen War officially ended in August 1996. It left behind a legacy of destruction and trauma. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands of civilians and thousands of soldiers on both sides lost their lives. Chechnya was in ruins, its economy shattered, and its society traumatized and militarized. Russia was left to grapple with its first major military defeat since the war in Afghanistan. The peace, however, was merely an intermission. The unresolved question of Chechnya's status, combined with the instability and radicalization that festered in the interwar years, would set the stage for a second, even more brutal conflict just 3 years later. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a complex and tragic chapter of modern history. Understanding these events helps us appreciate the fragility of peace and the devastating human cost of war. If you found this video informative, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next upload. We'll see you in the next one.